The first thing Officer Grant Holloway noticed was the car, a black Lexus sedan rolling through downtown Briarwood like it had every right to be there, which it did. The second thing he noticed was the woman behind the wheel, a black woman in a charcoal suit with a calm face and one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, and for some reason that bothered him more than it should have. By the time his red and blue lights flashed across her rearview mirror, Grant had already decided she was going to be a problem. He just had not realized yet that she was about to become the biggest problem of his entire career. It was one of those late spring evenings when Briarwood looked better than it deserved to. The sun hanging low over the brick buildings, turning the windows gold. People drifting out of restaurants and coffee shops with that tired little smile folks get when they have survived another workday. The street still had some traffic, but it was thinning out, and the radio in the Lexus was playing soft old jazz, the kind of music that makes you feel like maybe the world is not falling apart after all, even when you know better. The woman driving was named Camille Harper, and she had spent the last 10 hours in meetings reviewing reports, answering questions nobody else wanted to answer, and trying not to think about the stack of files waiting on her kitchen table at home. She had a habit of bringing work home even when she promised herself she would not. But tonight she had told herself she would make pasta, pour a glass of wine, and ignore her phone for at least an hour. That was the plan anyway. Plans have a funny way of falling apart when somebody else decides they are more important than yours. Camille slowed at the intersection of Mason and 4th just as the light turned yellow, then red, and she came to a full stop behind a delivery van. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, nothing that would make anyone look twice. But 30 seconds later, the police cruiser behind her lit up. At first she did not even realize the lights were for her. She checked her mirrors, looked ahead, then glanced back again, and there they were, bright red and blue flashing across the rear windshield. Her first thought was that maybe one of her brake lights was out. Her second thought was the same thought every black driver has had at least once in their life, the thought that arrives quietly but quickly, settling in your chest before you can stop it. Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. Do not move too fast. Do not give them a reason. She pulled into a small stretch of curb beside a closed bookstore, turned on her hazard lights, and waited. She watched in the rearview mirror as the officer climbed out of his cruiser. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, white, maybe late 40s, with the kind of stiff walk that suggested he believed every room, every sidewalk, every conversation belonged to him before he even entered it. His name tag read Holloway. His uniform looked freshly pressed, his boots polished enough to catch the streetlight, and he had the expression of a man who had never had to wonder whether people would take him seriously. Camille rolled down her window halfway. She kept both hands resting on the wheel. Officer Holloway leaned toward the opening, but he did not say hello. He did not explain why he had pulled her over. He did not ask whether she knew why she had been stopped. He just looked at her for a second too long, then said, "License and registration." Camille blinked once. She had been pulled over before. Everyone had. But something about his tone immediately felt wrong. Not loud, not openly aggressive, not yet, but sharp around the edges, like a knife. Somebody had been pretending was a butter knife. She gave him a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, officer. May I ask what I was stopped for?" Grant did not answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, into the car, over the leather seats, the closed laptop bag on the passenger side, the empty back seat, then back at her. "License and registration," he repeated. Camille let out a small breath through her nose, not quite a sigh. She reached slowly into the glove compartment, taking care to keep her movements visible, and handed in the documents. He took them without looking at her hand, then stared down at the license. Camille Harper. The name was printed clearly. So was her address. So was everything else he needed to know. Still, he stood there. "You rolled through that light," he said. Camille looked toward the intersection. "I stopped behind the delivery van when it turned red." Grant raised his eyebrows, like she had just told him the sky was made of candy. "Is that right?" "That is right," she said. He looked at her again, slowly this time. "What brings you through this part of town?" Camille almost laughed, but not because it was funny. It was because she had spent enough years in enough rooms to recognize nonsense when it came wearing a badge and pretending to be a question. "I live 3 blocks from here, officer. It is on my license." Grant glanced at the card again, though Camille could tell he had not really needed to. He was buying time. She knew that look. She had seen it in meetings, in hallways, in interviews, in the eyes of people who had already decided what they thought of you but wanted to make you work for the privilege of proving them wrong, Nice car for somebody who lives around here, he said. There it was, not a shout, not a slur, not something that could be easily quoted in a complaint, but there it was, the first crack in the mask. Camille kept her voice steady. Is there a problem with my car? Grant leaned closer. Depends. Camille looked at him. Depends on what? He smiled a little, but it was not a friendly smile. Depends on whether it is yours. For 1 second, the street seemed to go quiet. The traffic moved in the distance. A bus sighed at the next stoplight. Somebody laughed outside a bar down the block, but inside Camille's car, it felt like all the sound had been pulled out of the world. She had dealt with people like Grant before, not always police officers, sometimes bankers, sometimes landlords, sometimes executives who mistook condescension for intelligence. They all had their own version of the same question. Are you supposed to be here? Are you sure this belongs to you? Are you sure you belong in this room, in this neighborhood, in this car, in this life? Camille looked him directly in the eye. It is registered in my name, officer. The title is in my name. The insurance is in my name. Would you like to see any of those documents too? Grant's jaw tightened. You always this mouthy during a traffic stop? Camille tilted her head. You always accuse people of stealing their own car during a traffic stop? That was the first time his expression changed. Just a flicker, a small little twitch around the eyes. He had expected fear or irritation, maybe even anger. What he had not expected was someone who could hold up a mirror without raising her voice. He looked away from her for half a second, toward the street, then back again. Step out of the vehicle. Camille did not move. Her fingers stayed loose on the steering wheel. Officer, I have complied with every request you have made. If you are asking me to step out, I would appreciate knowing why. Grant straightened up. Are you refusing a lawful order? No, Camille said. I am asking a reasonable question. Grant leaned down again, this time close enough that she could smell coffee on his breath. Lady, you are making this a lot harder than it needs to be. Camille looked at him, calm and unblinking. No, officer, you are. That was when he took one step back and rested his hand near his belt. It was not a dramatic move. Not enough to justify a reaction, but enough to send a message. He wanted her to understand who had the power here. He wanted her to feel the weight of his uniform, his gun, his cruiser, the empty street, the fact that there were no witnesses standing close enough to hear every word. Camille understood all of that. She understood it very well, but she understood it very well. But she also understood something Grant Holloway did not. Power is not always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it is the person who knows exactly what is happening and exactly how far they are willing to let it go before they respond. Camille slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. She opened the door and stepped out onto the curb. The evening air had cooled and the sound of the city seemed louder now, sharper. Grant watched her stand up, his eyes flicking over the tailored jacket, the clean lines of her clothes, the low heels, the simple silver watch on her wrist. None of it fit whatever story he had already made up about her, and that seemed to make him more irritated. Put your hands on the hood, he said. Camille turned toward him. What am I being suspected of? Grant gave a little shrug. Standard procedure for what? You do not need to worry about that. Camille stared at him for a moment. Then she turned toward the hood of her car and placed both palms flat against the metal. She could feel the warmth from the engine under her hands. She could hear Grant moving behind her. Hear the leather of his duty belt creak. Hear his boots scrape lightly against the pavement. The search was slow, too slow. Not careless exactly, but deliberate in the way some people move when they want to remind you that they can. Camille focused on breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She had learned that years ago, long before she took the job she had now, back when she was still a young investigator trying to sit through difficult interviews without letting her face reveal what she was thinking. She had learned to listen. She had learned to wait. She had learned that most people eventually told you who they were if you gave them enough space. Grant Holloway was doing exactly that. After a few moments, he stepped back. Nothing, he muttered. Camille turned around slowly. I am shocked, she said, her voice dry enough to make it clear she was not shocked at all. Grant stared at her. You think this is funny? No, she said, I think it is predictable. He took a step toward her. You need to watch your attitude. Camille crossed her arms. My attitude? Officer Holloway, you pulled me over for a light I did not run, questioned whether my car belongs to me, asked why I was in my own neighborhood, and searched me without giving a clear reason. I would say my attitude has been remarkably good. Grant's face reddened a little. You people always make everything about race." The words came out before he could stop them. There are moments when a person says something so revealing that the whole world seems to pause around it. Camille felt one of those moments settle between them. Grant must have felt it too, because he blinked, then tried to recover. "I did not mean it like that," he said quickly. "No?" Camille asked. "Then how did you mean it?" He looked away. "I met people who act like the rules do not apply to them." Camille nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Interesting. So a woman asking why she is being searched becomes someone who thinks rules do not apply to her?" Grant did not answer. She took one small step closer, not aggressive, not threatening, just enough to make sure he understood she was not shrinking away. "What is it, officer? Is it the car? The suit? The fact that I am not crying? Or is it that I looked you in the eye and you did not like what you saw?" Grant's mouth opened, then closed. He was not used to people talking to him like that. He was used to compliance. He was used to people choosing the safest version of themselves around him. But Camille was not trying to win an argument. She was collecting a record. Every pause, every insult, every careless sentence was another thread pulling loose from the story he had been telling himself about being a good cop. "You are awfully familiar with police procedure," Grant said finally. "What do you do for work?" Camille looked at him for a long moment. "I work in a field where accountability matters," she said. "That is not an answer. It is the answer you are getting." Grant gave a humorless laugh. "You know what your problem is?" Camille looked at him. "I am sure you are about to tell me." Camille looked at him. "I am sure you are about to tell me? You think you are smarter than everybody else." Camille almost smiled. "No, officer. I just think you are making a mistake." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed. "What kind of mistake?" For the first time since he had walked up to her window, Camille let the silence sit. She let him feel it. The city noise moved around them. A car passed at the far end of the block. The light changed at the intersection, and Grant Holloway stood there with his hand hovering near his belt, suddenly less certain than he had been 10 minutes earlier. Camille reached slowly toward the inside pocket of her jacket. Grant's body went tight. His hand shifted lower, closer to his holster. Camille stopped moving and looked at him. "I am taking out my identification," she said calmly. "Nothing else." Grant did not answer. His eyes stayed fixed on her hand. Camille reached into her jacket, pulled out a slim black leather case, and held it between two fingers. Then she opened it. The badge inside caught the glow of the streetlight. Grant looked at it once, then again. His face changed so fast it almost would have been funny if the moment had not been so ugly. The confidence drained out of him first, then the anger, then the smug little certainty he had carried when he first walked up to her car. What remained was something pale and startled, something close to fear. Camille Harper said nothing for a moment. She let him read the badge. She let him take in the title beneath her name. Director of Professional Standards, Briarwood Police Department. Grant swallowed hard. "Camille," he said, but his voice had lost all of its edge. "No," she replied quietly. "Director Harper." And standing there beneath the flashing lights of his own cruiser, Officer Grant Holloway finally understood that the woman he had tried to intimidate was the person responsible for investigating officers just like him. Grant Holloway stared at the badge like it might somehow change if he looked away long enough. But it did not. It stayed right there in Camille Harper's hand, catching the red and blue light from his cruiser, calm and official and very real. For a few seconds, he did not say anything at all, which was strange because up until that moment, he had not seemed capable of leaving a single silence alone. Then he cleared his throat and tried to stand a little straighter. "Director Harper, I did not know who you were." Camille closed the leather case and slipped it back into her jacket. "That is exactly the problem," she said. Grant looked down at the pavement. Camille could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, all the little calculations, all the possible versions of this story he might tell later. Maybe he would say she had been difficult. Maybe he would say he smelled alcohol. Maybe he would say he thought he saw something suspicious in the car. People like Grant rarely walked away from a bad moment without trying to rewrite it into something more comfortable. He lifted his head again. "I was only doing my job." Camille gave him a look that was not angry so much as tired. "No, Officer Holloway, you were doing something else, and you know it." He started to speak, but she raised one hand. "Do not explain it to me right now. Do not tell me you were being careful. Do not tell me you were following procedure. You questioned whether my car belonged to me before you asked one useful question about a traffic violation. You searched me after failing to give a lawful reason. You made comments about where I live, how I dress, and whether I belong in this neighborhood. None of that came from procedure, it came from you. Grant's face went pale, then red, then pale again. I did not mean anything by it, he said. Camille nodded slowly. That may be the most common sentence in my line of work. People say it like intention is a magic eraser, like harm disappears because they did not bother to think about it before they caused it. Grant looked toward his cruiser. He wanted to leave. She could see it in his body, in the way his shoulders angled away from her, in the way his fingers kept tapping against the edge of his belt. But Camille was not finished. I want your body camera footage preserved, she said. I want your dash camera footage preserved. Your radio traffic, your dispatch log, your written report, everything. And I want you to notify your watch commander before you leave this block. Grant stared at her. You are opening an investigation? Camille looked back at him. I am filing a complaint. Because I was involved, I will not be the one assigned to investigate the individual case. That will go through the deputy director. But yes, Officer Holloway, there will be an investigation. His mouth tightened. So this is because I pulled over the wrong person. Camille took one step closer, her voice lower now. No. This is because you thought you had pulled over the right kind of person. That landed hard. Grant did not have a comeback for that one. For the first time all night, he looked small. Not because Camille was trying to make him feel that way, but because he had finally run into the full shape of what he had been doing. He gave her documents back with a hand that shook just slightly. You are free to go, he muttered. Camille took the license and registration and looked at him one more time. I was always free to go, officer. You just forgot that. She got back into her car, shut the door, and sat there for a moment before pulling away. Her hands were steady when she put the car into drive. But the second she turned the corner, they began to tremble. Not wildly, not dramatically. Just enough for her to notice. She pulled into an empty lot behind a closed pharmacy, put the car in park, and let her forehead rest against the steering wheel. The jazz station was still playing some old song about losing love on a rainy night, and for a second the whole thing felt almost absurd. A person could spend years building a career, earning titles, learning laws, sitting through interviews, writing reports, making hard decisions, and then one stranger with a badge could look at you for 10 minutes and decide none of it mattered. All he saw was whatever story he had already made up. Camille had worked in police oversight for 12 years. She knew the system better than most people ever would. She knew how complaints got buried, how language got softened, how a citizen's word could be turned into a question mark the moment it landed on the wrong desk. She knew that officers did difficult work, dangerous work, necessary work. She also knew that some departments treated accountability like a disease, something to be contained before it spread. What bothered her most was not that Grant had been openly rude. She had dealt with rude men her entire life. What bothered her was how familiar he seemed. The way he had tested the edges of the situation, looking for weakness, looking for fear, looking for permission to go further. That kind of behavior did not usually appear out of nowhere. It grew in places where nobody interrupted it. By the time Camille got home, it was past 9. Her apartment was quiet, warm, and exactly as she had left it. But she did not make pasta. She did not pour wine. She sat at the kitchen table with the lights off except for the small lamp near the window, opened her laptop, and wrote down every word she could remember. She wrote the time, the location, the order of events, the exact phrasing of his questions. She wrote, "Nice car for somebody who lives around here." She wrote, "You people always make everything about race." She wrote it all down because memory is fragile, especially after something that leaves your body buzzing long after it ends. At 10:14 that night, she emailed Deputy Director Naomi Brooks, the one person in the department she trusted to handle a complaint without turning it into theater. Naomi was not the kind of person who needed a long explanation. She had spent 20 years in investigations, had a dry sense of humor, a sharp eye for bad paperwork, and the patience of someone who had spent her career listening to people lie badly. Camille's email was short. "I need you to preserve all footage and open an independent review involving Officer Grant Holloway. I was directly involved, so I am recusing myself from the case. I will send my statement in the morning." Naomi replied 6 minutes later. "Understood. Do not speak to him again." And Camille, "I am sorry." That was all it said, but it was enough. The next morning, Briarwood Police Headquarters was buzzing before Camille even reached the 3rd floor. She could feel it in the air. That particular kind of nervous energy that moved through a building when people knew something had happened. but did not know how much trouble it was going to cause. A few officers looked up when she walked past. A few looked away too quickly. Somebody near the elevator stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. Camille did not slow down. She had learned long ago that if you walked through a hallway like you were expecting whispers, people would give you whispers. So she carried her coffee, nodded to the receptionist, and went straight to her office. 10 minutes later, Naomi stepped inside without knocking. She closed the door behind her and placed a thin folder on Camille's desk. "You were right to have me preserve everything," she said. Camille looked at the folder. "Already?" Naomi sat down across from her. "I pulled Holloway's body cam, dash cam, dispatch audio, and the report he tried to file after the stop." Camille looked up. "Tried to file?" Naomi gave her that flat look that meant the answer was not going to make anyone happy. "He wrote that he observed you making an abrupt stop at a traffic light, that you appeared nervous, and that he conducted a routine safety pat-down after you became verbally uncooperative." Camille leaned back in her chair. "Verbally uncooperative." Naomi nodded. "That phrase has done a lot of dirty work over the years." Camille closed her eyes for a moment. "And the footage?" Naomi slid the folder closer. "The footage tells a different story. He never mentioned the light until after he had your license. You were calm. You asked reasonable questions. There was no visible nervous behavior, no threat, no reasonable basis for the search. And the comment about your car is clear as day." Camille opened the folder but did not read it right away. Her eyes rested on the first page where Grant's name sat in black print above the incident number. Naomi watched her carefully. "There's more," she said. Camille looked up. "Holloway has 3 prior complaints in the last 4 years. 2 for biased traffic stops, 1 for excessive verbal aggression during a vehicle search. All 3 were closed without sustained findings." Camille felt something settle cold in her stomach. "What were the investigations like?" Naomi asked. "Thin, rushed, and strangely forgiving. 1 complaint was dismissed because the driver could not produce video. Another was marked inconclusive even though there was a passenger in the car. The 3rd never made it past preliminary review." Camille looked at her. "Who reviewed them?" Naomi hesitated for half a second. "Lieutenant Darren Kessler signed off on all 3. That name sat heavily in the room. Darren Kessler was the commander of the patrol division, a longtime Briarwood officer with a good public smile and a private reputation for protecting his people, no matter what they did. He was popular with the union, popular with city council members who liked to talk tough about crime, and popular with exactly the sort of folks who thought accountability was another word for betrayal. Camille had crossed paths with him before. He had never been openly hostile, but he had a way of making his opinions clear without ever putting them in writing. He believed the department had been too soft lately. He believed officers were under attack. He believed every complaint was the beginning of a witch hunt until proven otherwise. Naomi tapped the folder. "I do not think Holloway is the whole story." Camille did not answer for a moment. Outside her office window, the city moved through another ordinary morning. Buses rattled past. People crossed the intersection with coffee cups and backpacks. Somewhere below, a patrol car siren wailed briefly and faded into the distance. Camille had heard all the speeches, 1 bad apple, 1 mistake, 1 misunderstanding. But 3 complaints, all dismissed under the same commander, did not feel like 1 bad apple. It felt like an orchard nobody wanted to inspect. By noon, Chief Malcolm Reyes called Camille into his office. Reyes had been chief for 6 years, and he was the kind of man who looked permanently tired, not because he lacked energy, but because he carried every problem in the department like it had personally climbed onto his back. He had silver at his temples, a stiff posture, and a habit of rubbing the bridge of his nose whenever somebody mentioned politics. Camille had respected him for years, though respect and trust were not always the same thing. When she walked in, he was standing by the window with a file in one hand. Naomi had already briefed him. "This is going to become a problem," he said. Camille closed the door behind her. "It already is a problem." Reyes turned to face her. "You know what I mean. Holloway is going to claim he did not know who you were, that he made a bad judgment call, that he was having a rough shift, whatever else his representative tells him to say. Kessler will argue that this is an isolated incident. The union will argue that we are punishing an officer for 1 uncomfortable interaction." Camille folded her arms. "Was it uncomfortable because of who I am or because of what he did?" Reyes looked at her for a long moment, then he sighed. "Both? Probably." Camille walked to the chair in front of his desk but did not sit. "Chief, I am not asking you to punish him because he pulled over the director of professional standards. I am asking you to look at why he felt safe enough to do what he did before he knew who I was. That is the part that matters. Reyes lowered his eyes to the folder. There was a time, he said quietly, when that would have been enough. The footage would have been clean, the report would have been buried, and everybody would have moved on. Camille studied him. Are you saying you want to move on? No, he said. I am saying I know how hard this will be if we do not. There was honesty in that answer, and Camille respected honesty even when it came late. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Then let us stop pretending this is only about Grant Holloway. Let us audit every complaint against patrol officers that was closed without a full review in the last 5 years. Let us look at traffic stop data by race, neighborhood, gender, vehicle type. Let us look at who gets searched, who gets warned, who gets written up, and who gets ignored. Reyes looked at her like she had just suggested setting fire to the building and checking the ashes for termites. Camille knew how it sounded. She also knew how it needed to sound. Chief, she continued, if we only discipline one officer, everybody will call it justice and go back to work. But if the system made room for him to act like that, then the system needs to answer too. Reyes stood quietly for a while. Then he walked behind his desk, picked up the phone, and called his assistant. Clear my afternoon, he said. We are starting a review. News moved fast after that. Not public news, not yet, but department news. By the end of the day, every patrol officer in Briarwood seemed to know that something was happening. Grant Holloway was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. His badge and weapon were temporarily secured. His union representative, a heavy-set man named Frank Morrow with a booming voice and a permanent expression of offended disbelief, arrived before the paperwork was even finished. Frank had represented officers for nearly 30 years. He believed every investigation was personal. Every civilian complaint was exaggerated, and every investigator was trying to make a name for themselves. He met Camille outside the conference room on the second floor. Well, Director Harper, he said, stretching the title just enough to make it sound like an insult. You got what you wanted. Camille kept walking. No, Mr. Morrow. What I want is for officers to stop treating people like suspects because they do not like the way they look. Frank followed beside her. You know how dangerous the job is. Every stop is unpredictable. Camille stopped and turned toward him. You are right. It is unpredictable. That is why officers need judgment. Fear cannot be the only tool they bring to the job. Frank's face tightened. Holloway made a mistake. Maybe he did, Camille said. But mistakes have patterns. And patterns have names. She left him standing there in the hallway. That evening, Camille attended the first review meeting with Chief Reyes, Naomi, 2 analysts from the city data office, and a civil rights attorney named Marisol Vega, who had been brought in as an outside observer. Marisol was small, sharp, and impossible to rattle. She had spent years representing people who had been mistreated by government agencies, and she did not waste words. After an hour of reviewing records, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You have a culture problem." The room went quiet. One of the analysts looked down at his laptop. Chief Reyes stared at the table. Naomi crossed her arms. Camille did not flinch. Marisol continued. I am not saying every officer here is biased. I am saying the numbers show certain people are stopped more, searched more, and believed less. When complaints are filed, they are closed faster when the complainant has no video, no lawyer, no witness, no connection. That creates a message. Camille looked at the report on the screen. What message? Marisol met her eyes. That the system will believe the badge before it believes a person standing in front of it. Nobody argued because nobody could. Later that night, Camille drove home a different way. She did not want to pass Mason and Fourth. Not yet. Instead, she took the longer route along the river, where the streetlights reflected in the water and the city looked peaceful from a distance. She called her older brother Marcus, who had always been the one person capable of making her laugh when she was trying very hard not to cry. He answered on the third ring. You alive? He asked. Camille smiled despite herself. That is a cheerful way to answer the phone. I saw the news alert about Briarwood PD starting an internal review. You do not usually start those because somebody forgot to return a stapler. Camille was quiet for a second. You heard it. What happened? He asked, his voice softer now. Camille told him. Not every detail, not at first, but enough. She told him about the stop, the car, the search, the badge, the look on Grant's face when he realized who she was. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he let out a long breath. You okay? Camille looked out at the river. I am angry, she said. I know. But are you okay? She thought about that. I do not know yet. Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, you know what gets me? The fact that the only reason he is scared now is because you have a title. Camille gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. I know. That is what gets me too. A week later, the department held its first community listening session at the East Briarwood Civic Center. It was supposed to be a small meeting, maybe 50 people, a few local leaders, some business owners, a couple of reporters in the back. Instead, more than 200 people showed up. The folding chairs filled up fast. People stood along the walls. Some came angry. Some came curious. Some came because they had been carrying a story for years and finally thought someone might be willing to hear it. Camille stood near the side of the room before the meeting began, watching people find seats. She saw mothers holding children close, elderly men in work boots, teenagers with phones in their hands, a young woman with a notebook pressed to her chest like she had rehearsed what she wanted to say all day. This was the part no report could capture. Numbers could tell you who got stopped. They could tell you who got searched. They could tell you which neighborhoods had more complaints. But they could not tell you what it felt like to teach your kid where to put their hands when a police car lights up behind them. They could not tell you what it felt like to wonder whether asking a question would make things worse. When the meeting started, Chief Reyes gave a short statement about transparency and trust. It was careful, polished, and probably written by 3 different people. Then Camille walked to the microphone. She did not bring notes. She looked out at the crowd and said, I am not here tonight to convince you everything is fine. It is not. I am here because too many people have been asked to carry bad experiences alone, and that has to change. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a young man near the front stood up. He was maybe 23, wearing a blue work shirt with grease still under his fingernails. My name is Andre, he said. Last year, I got pulled over coming home from my job at a garage. They searched my car because they said I looked nervous. I was nervous because there were 2 officers yelling at me through my window. He gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. They found nothing. Did not apologize. Just told me to drive safe. The room stayed quiet. Camille nodded. I am sorry that happened to you, Andre. He looked at her. Sorry is nice, he said. But what changes? Camille looked at him, really looked at him. That is the right question, she said. And it is the question we have to answer with more than words. One by one, people began to speak. A grandmother talked about her grandson being handcuffed outside a grocery store because he matched a description that could have described half the city. A delivery driver described being stopped 3 times in 6 months while working the same route. A former officer stood up in the back and said he had watched younger cops get praised for aggressive stops while complaints quietly disappeared. The room grew heavier with every story. By the time the meeting ended, Camille felt like she had been carrying a weight in her chest for hours. As people began filing out, Marisol Vega came up beside her. You know this will make some people hate you, right? Camille looked around at the empty chairs. They already do. Marisol gave a small smile. Fair enough. Then she grew serious. But you're also going to have to decide how far you are willing to go. Because once the public hears these stories, they will expect action. Not another task force, not another statement. Action. Camille watched the last few people leave the room. Across the hall through the glass doors, she saw Lieutenant Darren Kessler standing in the shadows near the exit. He had not spoken during the meeting. He had not introduced himself. He had simply watched. When Camille looked directly at him, he gave her a thin smile, the kind people give when they are already planning a fight. Then he turned and walked away. Camille stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of the building after the crowd had gone. She knew Grant Holloway's hearing was coming soon. She knew the evidence against him was stronger than he probably realized. But as she watched Kessler disappear down the hall, she understood something else too. Grant was not the end of this story. He was the first door. And behind that door, there was a whole department waiting to decide whether it wanted to change or whether it would do everything it could to protect itself. The first sign of the department had chosen to fight back came 2 days later, and it did not come from Grant Holloway. It came from Lieutenant Darren Kessler. Camille was in her office early, going through the latest complaint data with Naomi, when her assistant knocked once and stepped inside with the careful face people use when they are about to deliver something unpleasant. Lieutenant Kessler is in the lobby, she said. He says he needs to speak with you privately. Camille looked at Naomi. Naomi did not look surprised. Of course he does, she said. Camille stood up slowly, straightened the sleeve of her jacket, and walked downstairs. Kessler was waiting near the front entrance with his hands in his pockets. looking less like a police lieutenant and more like a man waiting outside a restaurant after being told his table would not be ready. He gave Camille a polite smile when he saw her. "Director Harper," he said. "Got a minute?" Camille looked at the glass doors behind him, then back at his face. "You have one." Kessler's smile tightened. "I hear you have been busy." Camille did not answer. The lobby was quiet except for the hum of the security scanner and the distant buzz of a vending machine down the hall. Kessler stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know you believe you are doing the right thing here. I really do. But you are creating a situation that is getting bigger than one traffic stop." Camille folded her arms. It was always bigger than one traffic stop. He nodded, almost patiently, like she had said something naive. "Maybe, but the people in this department are scared. They feel like they are being judged before anyone has seen the whole picture. Grant made mistakes, sure. Nobody is saying he handled it perfectly." Camille raised an eyebrow. "Nobody?" Kessler ignored that. "But he is not some monster. He has a wife, 2 kids, a mortgage, 15 years on the job. He has put himself in dangerous situations for this city, and now everyone is acting like he woke up one day planning to ruin somebody's life." Camille studied him. "Is that what you think happened?" Kessler looked at her. "I think he made a bad call. I think you are turning it into a public execution." Camille took a breath, slow and controlled. "Lieutenant, I did not ask Officer Holloway to question whether I own my own car. I did not ask him to search me without cause. I did not ask him to tell me that people like me always make things about race. He made those choices." Kessler's expression shifted, just slightly. He did not like hearing the words repeated out loud. People never do. They prefer accusations in summary form, softened around the edges, made easier to deny. Camille kept going. "And what concerns me is not only that he made those choices, it is that he seemed comfortable making them. That tells me he expected nobody would stop him." Kessler looked toward the street through the glass. A bus rolled past in the morning traffic, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he turned back to her. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you got embarrassed, and now you want to make an example out of him." Camille almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly backwards. She looked at him for a long second. "Lieutenant, I was not embarrassed. I was angry. There is a difference." He gave a short, humorless smile. "Sure there is." Camille leaned in just enough for him to hear every word clearly. "You want to know what would embarrass me? Sitting in my office and pretending this is acceptable because the officer involved has a mortgage. People who were stopped, searched, humiliated, and treated like criminals also had mortgages. They had children. They had jobs. They had lives that mattered before someone with a badge decided otherwise." Kessler's face hardened. "You are making enemies." Camille nodded. "Then maybe they need to ask themselves why." She turned and walked away before he could answer. By noon, someone had leaked part of the internal review to a local reporter. The headline was not kind. "Briarwood Police under scrutiny after Director Alage's racially biased stop." It spread through the city by lunchtime, passed from phone to phone, posted in neighborhood groups, argued about under restaurant photos and baby announcements and ads for lawn care. Some people called Camille brave. Some called her divisive. A few called her worse things. That was the ugly part of doing public work. People who had never met you could decide exactly who you were based on a headline and a photograph. By that evening, the police union had released a statement saying Officer Holloway deserved due process and warning against what it described as a rush to judgment. Camille read it once, then set her phone face down on the kitchen counter. Her brother Marcus called again. "You eating?" he asked. Camille looked at the untouched soup on her stove. "Technically, there is food in my apartment. That was not my question." She smiled despite herself. "No." Marcus paused. "You need to eat." "I know. And sleep." "I know. And sleep." "I know. And sleep." "I know." "And stop reading comments." Camille looked at her phone. "I know." There was a silence on the line. Then Marcus said, "You are going to keep going, right?" Camille looked out her kitchen window. Across the street, a little boy was riding a bicycle in circles while his mother sat on the porch watching him. A dog barked somewhere nearby. Somebody was grilling dinner, and the smell drifted through the open window. Normal life, moving along as if nothing had happened. That was always the strange part. A person could be standing in the middle of a storm, and the world still expected them to pick up groceries. "Yes," Camille said. "I am going to keep going." The hearing for Officer Holloway was scheduled for the following Monday. It was not a criminal trial. Nobody was going to bang a gavel or shout objections. It was an internal administrative hearing. The kind that could determine whether an officer kept his badge, lost his job, or walked away with a warning and a second chance. But there was nothing small about it. By 9 that morning, the conference room on the 6th floor was full. Chief Reyes sat at one end of the long table. Naomi Brooks sat beside him with a stack of files. Marisol Vega was there as the outside observer. 2 city attorneys attended by video. Frank Morrow sat beside Grant Holloway, along with the private lawyer the union had brought in. And at the far side of the room, against the wall, stood Lieutenant Darren Kessler, with his arms crossed and his face carefully blank. Grant looked different from the man Camille had met on Mason and 4th. His uniform was gone. He wore a dark suit that did not quite fit him right, like he had put it on in a hurry. His hair was combed too neatly. His hands were clasped together on the table, but his thumb kept rubbing against the side of his index finger, over and over, the way people do when they are trying to hold themselves together. Camille sat across from him. She did not look at him with satisfaction. She did not look at him with anger. She just looked at him. Grant kept his eyes down. The first hour was mostly records. Naomi walked everyone through the dash camera footage, then the body camera footage, then the dispatch audio. Nobody spoke while the room listened to Grant's own voice ask Camille why she was in her own neighborhood, question whether the Lexus belonged to her, and order her out of the car without explaining why. It was strange hearing it played back in a room full of people. On the street that night, the words had felt sharp and personal. In the hearing room, they sounded colder, more official, like evidence. When the recording reached the point where Grant said, "You people always make everything about race," Frank Morrow shifted in his chair. Grant's lawyer cleared his throat. Kessler looked at the wall. Camille did not move. Naomi stopped the recording. She turned to Grant. "Officer Holloway, do you dispute that this is your voice?" Grant swallowed. "No." "Do you dispute that Director Harper was compliant throughout the stop?" "No." "Do you dispute that you searched her without articulating reasonable suspicion in your report?" Grant's jaw tightened. "I believe there was a safety concern." Naomi looked down at the report in front of her. "What safety concern?" Grant hesitated. She was argumentative. Camille looked at him then, not angrily, just directly. Grant's eyes flickered toward her, then away. Naomi's voice stayed calm. "Being argumentative is not reasonable suspicion. What safety concern did you observe?" He did not answer. Frank Morrow leaned forward. Officer Holloway was alone on a nighttime stop with an individual who was challenging his commands. Naomi turned to him. "Mr. Morrow," she did not challenge his commands. She asked why she was being ordered out of her vehicle. Frank held up his hands. "I am saying officers have to make quick decisions." Marisol finally spoke, and citizens have to live with them. The room went quiet again. Chief Reyes looked at Grant. "Officer Holloway," he said, "this is your opportunity to explain your actions." Grant lifted his head slowly. His voice was low at first. "I thought she was suspicious." Camille felt something in her chest tighten. "Suspicious? How?" Naomi asked. Grant looked uncomfortable. The car, the way she was dressed, the fact that she was driving through that area at that time. Camille could not help it. She let out one quiet breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Grant looked at her. She spoke before anyone else could. "So let me understand this," she said. "A black woman in a suit, driving home in a nice car in the neighborhood where she lives at 8 o'clock in the evening, was suspicious to you." Grant's face flushed. "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you said," Camille replied. "You just used more words to say it." His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something under his breath. Grant stared at the table for a moment. Then he said, "I was trying to protect the neighborhood." Camille held his gaze. "From me?" That question stayed in the room like smoke. Grant did not answer. He could not, because every possible answer only made the truth worse. Finally, he said, "I made assumptions." Camille nodded slowly. "Yes, you did. And when you had the power to act on those assumptions, you did." The hearing paused after lunch, and during the break, Naomi pulled Camille aside into a small conference room near the elevators. She shut the door behind them. "We found something," she said. Camille looked at her. "What?" Naomi placed a printed email chain on the table. It had been recovered from an old archive account connected to Kessler's patrol division. The chain was nearly 3 years old. One of the earlier complaints against Grant had been flagged for possible review after a young Latino driver claimed Grant had called him a gang member during a routine stop. The internal investigator had recommended a formal interview, but before the review could move forward, Kessler had written an email to a supervisor. It was only 3 sentences long. Do not elevate this unless there is video. Holloway is one of ours. We do not need another civilian fishing expedition. Camille read it twice. The words were plain, almost casual. That was what made them worse. Kessler had not sounded like someone carefully plotting a cover-up. He had sounded like someone who believed this was normal. Someone who had sent that kind of email before. Naomi watched Camille's face. There are more, she said. Several. Similar language. Similar cases. Camille set the papers down. Rise, Chief Reyes, no? Naomi nodded. He is deciding whether to bring it into the hearing now or open a separate investigation. Camille looked through the conference room window toward the hallway. Kessler was still out there, talking quietly with Frank Morrow. He did not know what Naomi was holding in her hands. Not yet. Camille could have waited. She could have let the process move slowly and carefully, one file at a time. Part of her wanted to. The cautious part. The part that knew every big move created backlash. But then she thought about Andre in the community meeting. She thought about the grandmother whose grandson had been handcuffed outside a grocery store. She thought about every person who had filed a complaint and been told there was not enough evidence, not enough proof, not enough reason to believe them. She looked back at Naomi. Bring it in. When the hearing resumed, the room felt different. Chief Reyes had the email chain in front of him now. Kessler had noticed. Camille could tell by the way his shoulders had gone stiff. Naomi stood and addressed the room. Before we continue with Officer Holloway's testimony, new information has been entered into the record regarding prior complaints and supervisory handling. Kessler's lawyer was not there because, until that moment, Kessler had not been the subject of the hearing. But he understood immediately what was happening. He stepped forward. Chief, he said, this is not relevant to Officer Holloway's conduct. Chief Reyes looked at him. It may be relevant to how Officer Holloway's conduct was allowed to continue. Kessler's face hardened. That email is 3 years old. It was an internal operational discussion. Marisol leaned forward. An internal operational discussion about suppressing a complaint unless there was video? Kessler turned to her. You do not understand the reality of police work. Marisol did not blink. I understand the reality of people being told their word does not matter unless they happen to be recording while they are afraid. Kessler looked around the room searching for support. Frank Morrow looked down. Grant looked sick. Chief Reyes picked up the first email. Lieutenant Kessler, he said, did you write this? Kessler hesitated. Then he said, yes. And do you stand by it? Kessler's mouth tightened. I stand by protecting officers from false accusations. Camille spoke quietly. Protecting officers from false accusations is not the same as protecting them from consequences. Kessler turned toward her and something in his face finally slipped. You think you are better than us because you sit behind a desk and pick apart split-second decisions. You have no idea what it is like out there. Camille stood slowly from her chair. The room watched her. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You are right, Lieutenant. I do not know what it is like to stand on a street corner with a gun on my hip, wondering whether the next call will be dangerous. But you know what I do understand? I understand what it is like to be standing in your own neighborhood, obeying the law, and still be treated like a threat because someone in uniform decided you looked out of place. I understand what it is like to have the power to make another person feel small, and I understand the responsibility that comes with refusing to use that power carelessly. Kessler stared at her. Camille continued, nobody is asking officers to be perfect. We are asking them to be honest. We are asking them to see people before they see stereotypes. We are asking supervisors to stop treating every complaint like an attack on the badge. If that feels like betrayal to you, then maybe you have confused loyalty with silence for too long. Nobody spoke after that, not because Camille had delivered some grand speech. She had not. She had simply said the thing everyone in that room had been avoiding. Chief Reyes looked down at the emails again, then back at Kessler. Lieutenant Kessler, effective immediately. You're being placed on administrative leave pending a separate investigation into supervisory misconduct. Kessler stared at him. You cannot be serious. Reyes did not look away. I am. Kessler laughed once, sharp and bitter. This department is going to regret this. Maybe, Chief Reyes said, but not as much as we would regret doing nothing. Kessler left the room without another word. He did not slam the door. He did not make a scene. That was almost worse. He simply walked out with his jaw clenched, his shoulders stiff, carrying all the anger of a man who had spent years believing the rules were meant for other people. Grant watched him go, and something changed in his face. Camille saw it. Not redemption, not yet, but recognition. Maybe Grant had spent years telling himself he was just doing what everybody else did. Maybe he had convinced himself that the jokes, the assumptions, the aggressive stops, the quiet dismissals of complaints were all part of the job. Maybe Kessler had taught him that protecting the badge mattered more than protecting the public. That did not excuse him. Nothing could. But it explained why the problem had grown roots. Chief Reyes turned back to Grant. "Officer Holloway," he said, "do you have anything else you wish to say before this panel makes its recommendation?" Grant sat quietly for a long time. His lawyer whispered to him, but Grant did not respond. Finally, he looked at Camille. When he spoke, his voice sounded different than it had on the street that night. Smaller, but not in a pitying way. More honest. "I was wrong," he said. Camille did not move. Grant looked down again. "I thought being cautious meant I could trust my instincts no matter what they were. I thought if someone made me uncomfortable, that was enough. I did not stop to ask why I felt uncomfortable. I just assumed I was right." He swallowed. "I did not see you as a person that night. I saw a problem I wanted to control." Camille let that sit for a moment. Then she asked, "And if I had not shown you that badge?" Grant closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked older. "I do not know," he said. Camille nodded. That was the most honest answer he had given all day. The panel met in private for nearly 2 hours. Camille was not part of the final decision because she'd been directly involved. But she waited in her office while Naomi and Chief Reyes reviewed the findings. She tried to work. She answered 2 emails, then deleted both replies because she could not remember what she had written. She made coffee and forgot to drink it. She stood by the window and watched rain begin to fall over Briarwood, soft at first, then harder, blurring the streets below into streaks of silver and gray. By late afternoon, Naomi came into her office carrying a final envelope. Camille turned around. Naomi looked tired. "So," Camille asked, "what did they decide?" Naomi placed the envelope on the desk. Grant Holloway was terminated from the department. Camille looked at the envelope but did not touch it. Naomi continued. "The panel found sustained violations for biased conduct, abuse of authority, improper search, false reporting, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His certification will be referred to the State Board for review." Camille breathed out slowly. "And Kessler? Separate investigation. But the chief has already ordered a full audit of complaint handling and patrol. All unresolved cases from the last 5 years are being reopened." Camille nodded. It was not joy she felt. It was not victory exactly. It was relief mixed with grief, because no matter how necessary the decision was, it came attached to the knowledge that it should have happened long before she had been pulled over. Naomi leaned against the doorframe. "You know people are going to say this was too harsh." Camille looked at the rain. "Some people will say it was not harsh enough." The backlash came exactly as expected. By the end of the week, there were rallies outside headquarters. One group carried signs that said, "Support our police." Another carried signs that said, "Accountability is not hate." Local radio hosts argued about whether Grant had been fired for bias or for bad judgment. City council members made statements that sounded careful enough to mean nothing. The union filed an appeal. Online, strangers tore the story apart like it was a game. Some said Grant deserved everything that happened. Some said Camille had destroyed a man's life over a few badly chosen words. Some said Kessler was the real villain. Some said none of it would matter because the department would eventually return to business as usual. Camille read none of it. Mostly. She read a few comments at 2 in the morning one night, which was a mistake, but she was human. Then she put the phone down and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the rain tap against the window. A month later, the Briarwood Police Department held another community meeting, this time in the large auditorium at City Hall. The room was packed again, but the feeling was different. The first meeting had been full of pain. This one was full of expectation. People wanted to know what had changed. They wanted specifics. They wanted dates, policies, names, consequences. Camille stood backstage beside Chief Reyes while the moderator introduced them. Reyes looked at her. "You ready?" Camille gave him a small smile. "No, but I am here." He nodded. "That is probably the best anybody can do." When Camille walked onto the stage, the applause was scattered at first, then louder. She waited until the room settled. There were people who supported her, people who distrusted her, people who were still angry, and people who were watching closely to see whether this was another promise that would disappear once the cameras left. Camille understood all of that. She stepped up to the microphone. "A month ago," she said, "I was stopped by an officer on my way home. What happened to me was wrong. But the truth is, it mattered, because it was not only about me. The room grew quiet. Camille continued, "It mattered because too many people in this city have stories like mine, except they did not have a title, a badge, a camera, or someone in the department willing to listen. That should never be the difference between being believed and being ignored." She explained the changes one by one: new body camera requirements, independent review for certain types of civilian complaints, mandatory training focused on bias recognition and de-escalation, a public dashboard showing traffic stop data, community representatives added to the complaint review board, supervisors required to explain in writing when a complaint was dismissed. None of it sounded glamorous. None of it came with movie music or fireworks. Real change rarely did. Most of the time, it looked like policy manuals, difficult meetings, better records, and people refusing to let old habits hide in the dark. But as Camille spoke, she could see people listening, really listening. In the third row, Andre, the young mechanic from the first community meeting, was sitting beside his mother. He raised his hand when the moderator opened the floor. Camille nodded to him. He stood. "So what happens now?" he asked. "You fired one officer, you put one lieutenant on leave. What happens when the next person gets stopped and the officer thinks they can do the same thing?" Camille looked at him for a moment. It was a fair question. It'd be the most important one. Then she said, "Then we make sure they know someone will see it. We make sure the person they stop knows their voice matters. We make sure supervisors understand that silence is no longer protection, and if we fail, we do not hide it. We face it and fix it." Andre nodded slowly, but he did not smile. Camille respected that. Trust was not applause. Trust was time. Trust was proof. As the meeting ended, people gathered near the stage. Some wanted to shake Camille's hand. Some wanted to tell her their stories. One older man with a cane looked at her and said, "My daughter stopped talking about what happened to her years ago because she thought nobody would care. I am going to tell her about this." Camille felt her throat tighten. "Tell her we care now," she said, "and tell her we should have cared then." Later that night, after the crowd had gone and City Hall had emptied out, Camille walked alone through the lobby. The building was quiet, the polished floors reflecting the ceiling lights. She stepped outside and stood on the stone steps for a moment. Briarwood was spread out in front of her. The same streets, the same buses, the same storefronts, the same people heading home after long days. Somewhere out there, officers were beginning night shift. Somewhere, drivers were checking their mirrors when they saw police lights behind them. Camille knew one hearing could not erase years of fear. One policy could not undo every bad stop. One firing could not repair every broken piece of trust. But it was a start, and starts mattered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Naomi. Heard the union filed the appeal. Camille looked at it for a moment, then typed back, "Of course they did." Naomi replied almost immediately, "You ready for round 2? Camille smiled, tired but steady. "No," she wrote, "but I am here." And maybe that was the real point of the whole story. Not that Camille had a badge hidden in her pocket. Not that Grant Holloway had finally faced consequences. Not even that a lieutenant who thought he was untouchable had been forced to answer for what he helped create. The point was that power only changes when somebody refuses to look away from it. The question was never whether Grant should have known who Camille Harper was. The question was why he believed he could treat any stranger that way in the first place. And maybe that is the question every community has to ask itself sooner or later. When someone with authority crosses the line, should one apology be enough? Should one mistake end a career? Or is the real failure the system that watched warning signs pile up and chose comfort over accountability? Tell us what you think in the comments. Was Officer Grant Holloway given a fair consequence, or should he have been offered another chance after admitting he was wrong? And what about Lieutenant Kessler? Was he the bigger problem all along? Share your opinion, because the hardest conversations are often the ones we need most. If this story stayed with you, hit like, subscribe, and send it to someone who believes fairness should not depend on who is behind the wheel, who is wearing the uniform, or who has the power in the room.